Right, okay, this is dynamic here. When do I break it back? How do you decide that? When do you break it back? Because of course, if you break it back this falls to this. Alright, so I'm hoping, so I do apologise, yes, I've managed to forget to bring the proper copy. Right, so what we're going to do today is look at the rest of Hegel's account of infinity, and then we will go into being the self and see how far we get. If the timing works out, as I think it will, then we should have a good deal of time left over next week for a more sort of general discussion and review of the logic. So, because I am aware of the fact that it can be, there hasn't been a lot of time for discussion, but it also can be quite difficult when you've just absorbed this stuff. But I'm hoping that everything that's been saved up we can talk about next week. So that includes going back over details that are not clear, looking at the relevance of what Hegel's doing, all those criticisms you've been storing up, then that's the time to bring them out, because I think then you will have done a large chunk and it will be fair to raise the critical points that you've got. I mean, the point was never to say to you, don't criticize Hegel, it was just don't criticize until you know what's going on. Well, I think you do now know what's going on. So please, obviously, I'm going to set aside time, so I hope that you do have things you want to discuss next week. But there will be more material to cover as well in the first hour. All right, so Hegel's account of infinity arises right out of his account of finitude, and that is itself significant, that Hegel thinks you can understand what it is to be finite without reference to the infinite. And of course, not all philosophers, Descartes, for example, being one of them, would agree with that. In the section on the transition from finitude to infinity, Hegel identifies two different conceptions of infinity. One is really just endless finitude, and that arises because the finite in ending comes to be a negative that is not just nothing, not just it doesn't just leave a complete vacuum, but it leaves a negative that is not just a negative. But that is precisely the determination of the finite. So the finite in ceasing to be gives way to another finite, which in ceasing to be gives way to another finite, and so on to infinity ad infinitum. So that is the first conception of infinity. Infinity simply being that being that doesn't end. Because there's not, at this stage, a lot more complexity to that. Finite being is that determinate being of something that does end, and infinite being is that being that doesn't end. It's infinite. But initially it consists just of an endless series of finites. But then he argues that the finite in ending comes to be what it is implicitly. As he puts it, closer, this is page 136, gamma, but then beta under gamma. Closer consideration of this result shows that the finite in its ceasing to be, in this negation of itself, has attained its being in itself, is united with itself. It's fulfilled its determination, it's come to be what it intrinsically is, i.e. non-being. So there you get a different sense of infinite being. Infinite being not as an endless sequence of finites, but as a continuing in another finite of the being of the first finite. And so think of Leibniz's example of Abraham's ram being sacrificed and turning into ash. You can think of that ash as another finite, which will then turn into something else. Or you can think of it as what the ram, as it were, was destined to be. The ram in another form. And insofar as you think of it in that way, then we have a different conception of infinite being, unending being. Being that continues without end in and through the succession of finites. Okay, so that gives us then the two initial conceptions of infinity, which will come back again, as we'll see later today, in the form of the progress to infinity, which will repeat in a slightly different form the idea of endlessness, and then also true infinity, which will repeat in a different form this notion of continuity. Now, the finite in proving to be infinite in this second sense proves to be being that is qualitatively different from finite being. It's being that doesn't end as opposed to being that does end. And so in that sense it turns into its opposite, and as such initially disappears. The succession of finites proves to be infinite, non-ending being. And this is why I think Hegel concludes section A, under the infinite, with the otherwise rather startling claim, this is on page 138, that thus the finite has vanished in the infinite, and what is only the infinite. That's because finite being, in ending, proves to be qualitatively different, unending being. But as always with Hegel, you've got to think of the philosophical account somewhat like a drama. Hegel's not just presenting through time a single static image of the world. The categories change as they're unfolded. And a change occurs right at the beginning of B. That's the alternating determination of the finite and the infinite. Through the highlighting of the moment of negation in the infinite. So he says the infinite is, in this immediacy, it is at the same time the negation of another of the finite, as thus in the form of simple being, and at the same time as the non-being of another, it has fallen back into the category of something, as a determinate being in general. More precisely, the category of something with a limit. But that, of course, revives the finite as the other to the infinite. So, in fact, the finite does stand in relation. Sorry, the finite is there in relation to the infinite after all, and it's revived by the very moment of negation that's inherent in infinite being. And that you see there already. You see basically the fundamental ambiguity that will then be worked out on the rest of this page. That the infinite, on the one hand, is the unending being in which there is no finitude. On the other hand, it is the negation of the finite, and so it sets itself in relation to a finite, which is there after all. Okay, so, and that is an example of something that happens later in the logic, for example, at the beginning of Essence, where you get a new concept coming in this case, infinity, which you would think, being a new concept, then wouldn't exhibit the structures that we've just been going through, because they belong to finite being. And indeed, when we get to the true infinite, we will see that it does indeed have a different structure from what we've been analysing. But because of the moment of negation within it, it falls right back into the structures we've just looked at. As later on, essence, which is fundamentally different from being, will just prove initially to be another kind of being, essential being rather than essential being. Okay, right, so we have the idea then that the finite and the infinite are other than one another. But then he goes on, and I think I did look at this last time, but I'll just go over it again, to say that at the top of 139, this is the second paragraph under B, the finite and the infinite, or the infinite and the finite, are not in these categories of relation only. So they're not just other than one another. Why? Because the infinite is also the sort of negatedness, the vanishedness of the finite. So maybe I won't go through all of the details of the remains of that paragraph, but just skip forward to the idea that the infinite is then not just other than the finite, but it's the non-finite. What gets us to there? I mean, in a way, although the text is a little bit dense at this point, the series of thoughts is really quite easy to follow. So you first have the thought at the end of section A that the finite vanishes in the infinite. The infinite is where the finite isn't. It's the negatedness, it's the vanishedness of the finite. Then under B, you get a new thought that in fact the infinite is the negation of the finite, and so revives the finite. It's something other than the finite, which is itself something other than it. So now they're in relation to one another as others, as something that other than one another. But in fact it remains true that the infinite is the negatedness of the finite. So the infinite remains other than the finite, but as its vanishedness, as its negatedness. And it's that turns the infinite into what Hegel calls the non-finite, das Nicht-Endliche, as opposed to just the infinite. And he hyphenates it in the German. And it's that idea of the non-finite which is then described as the bad infinite. And we looked at that last time. The bad infinite then being the infinite that is beyond the finite, not just as that which is other than the finite, but as that which is where there is no longer any finitude. Hegel calls this the infinite of the understanding, although I think that doesn't mean to say that it's a product of the understanding. In fact, actually, I don't know if any of you know of a book by Michael Teunissen called Sein und Schein, Being and Seeming, Being and Illusion. It's a really, really important and good book. It's one of the best there is on the logic. If I can find something to write with. It's in German, unfortunately, so of course if you don't read German, that's a bit of a problem. And it's one of the books that really, I don't know why it hasn't been translated, but Michael Teunissen, who is quite a significant philosopher, he's written also on theological questions, and he's wrote a book called Sein und Schein, and a basic argument of it is that the logic should be seen as both the presentation of what it is to be, but also as a criticism. It sees the logic as a work of critique. Anyway, one of the features of this book, I mean the book is really very interesting, one of the features I think that's problematic about it is that Teunissen seems to think that these early categories, including that of the bad infinite in the logic, are really the product of understanding. And that what Hegel's showing are precisely the problems that the understanding gets itself into. But I don't know that that's really fair, because I've tried to argue that these categories aren't just misunderstandings. I mean, Pippin has a similar kind of view at times to it, that the logic of being is showing you categories that don't work properly, sort of failed attempts to think determinacy. But I don't know that that's true. I think what Hegel's doing here is unpacking what it is to be. And one of the forms that is made necessary by being is bad infinity. Now, the understanding latches on to that, and that becomes the infinite of the understanding. But Parce Teunissen, I don't think that the understanding is responsible for this conception of bad infinity. And I've tried to explain in the opening of Hegel's logic, or give a couple of examples, of the way in which Hegel thinks that bad infinity, as it were, does belong to the world. In many ways, many cases, we are it. But it's possible to argue, actually, that Hegel's account of light and the philosophy of nature exhibits a number of the features that belong to bad infinity. And of course, I would be committed to that reading. If the logic is an ontology, then it's got to be an ontology all the way through. So even concepts like the bad infinite have got to be ontological ones, which means there's got to be a bad infinity in the world. Now, the progress to infinity that we'll get to in a minute, that's not so much of a problem. That is clearly part of the world as Hegel understands it. But anyway, But having said that, the understanding does latch onto this, and then I indicated last time, Hegel sees this as the logical foundation of the sort of of the idea of two worlds. The idea that Nietzsche will then criticize in that, all over the place. But for example, one of the best statements is that section in Twilight of how the true world became a fable. So that basic distinction between the true world and the apparent world, although that's a more sort of essential distinction from Hegel's point of view, is clearly already anticipated here. And in contrast to Nietzsche, Hegel doesn't trace the genesis of this two-world theory back to resentment or weak will to power or the inability to cope with the present, but simply to a logical feature, namely that the infinite is understood as the negation of the finite. Now, of course, that's not incompatible with Hegel's view. It just means that Hegel would be focusing on the logical conception of the infinite that is at work here. Okay, so that's where we got to last time, as I recall. So I now want to sort of move on into the following paragraph, which is on page 140, the one that begins, "As thus separated, they are just as much essentially connected." So, what Hegel's arguing here is that the finite and the infinite aren't just limited with respect to one another. Okay, if you're looking at the Di Giovanni, this is, it's under B, and then we've got, it's just after the infinite, which is itself finite, which is where he talks about the two worlds, and there's another paragraph that begins, "This contradiction develops its content." And then we've got, "As thus separated, they're just as much essentially connected," or however Giovanni translates that. So, okay, so the thought here is that they're not just limited with respect to one another, but that each is actually intrinsically limited within itself. This is obvious to see in the case of the infinite, because the infinite is the non-finite, it's the infinite. So it is within itself infinite, not finite. But similarly, once the finite is now in that relation, it is the finite, not the infinite. And so I think that's what he means by saying that they are sort of bound together, bezogen aufeinander, related to one another, in their separateness. So each is self-related, separate from the other, but separate as not the other. So again, actually, although I don't want to get too complicated here, this is beginning to look forward to what we will get in essence. Okay, so this is, I won't read all of it. The lines from "As thus separated" bring out the point that I've just mentioned. It's line 4 there, I think. 2 in such a manner that each of them does not have its limit in it merely relative to another, but the negation is their being in itself. The limit is thus present in each on its own account. So each is in itself limited with respect to the other. Right, the next bit gets a little bit complicated, unfortunately. But again, I think once you've got it, the ideas are relatively okay to understand. The first thought is, that follows from where we are, is that the finite then, as we've seen, passes over into the infinite. We saw that in the transition from the finite to the infinite. But what does it pass over into? It passes over into an infinite which is in itself the infinite, not the finite. So the finite passes over into an infinite from which finitude is excluded. This, I think, is what is being said in the sentence that begins, "It is readily conceded." Or maybe I'll just start a few lines back. So you've got the limit is present each on its own account, in separation from the other, then skip the next sentence, then in the middle it goes as follows. However, each as affirmatively self-related is also the negation of its limit. Each thus immediately repels the limit as its non-being from itself, and as qualitatively separated from it, posits it as another being outside it. The finite positing its non-being as this infinite, and the infinite simply the finite. So that's just stating that each then, while being bound to the other as not the other, is not the other in such a way that it sort of expels the other and places it outside it. Then he looks at the finite and the infinite in turn. So he's now looking at the finite. It's readily conceded, he says, that there is a necessary transition from the finite to the infinite, necessary through the determination of the finite, and that the finite is raised to the form of being in itself. Since the finite, although persisting as a determinate being, is at the same time also determined as in itself nothing, and therefore as destined to bring about its own dissolution. So that's first saying, just reminding us that the finite becomes the infinite, in which it is itself no longer present. Whereas the infinite, although determined as burdened with negation and limit, is at the same time also determined as possessing being in itself. So that this abstraction of self-related affirmation constitutes its determination, and hence finite determinate being is not present in it. So the finite turns into nothing, becomes its own nothingness, namely the infinite, but the infinite is that in which the finite is not present. So again, the finite becomes the infinite from which it is excluded. It becomes its own opposite. The infinite, too, turns itself into its opposite from which it is excluded and which it excludes. So the infinite turns into the finite that is in turn excluded by the infinite. This is what he says in the next couple of lines. But it has been shown that the infinite itself attains affirmative being only by means of negation, as the negation of negation, as the negation of the finite, and that when this affirmation is taken as merely simple qualitative being, the negation contained in it is reduced to a simple immediate negation, and thus to a determinism limit, which then, as in contradiction with the being in itself of the infinite, is posited as excluded from it. Okay, so once again, the infinite attains affirmative being by means of negation, as negation of negation, and so as affirmation, as affirmative being. And when its affirmation is taken as merely simple qualitative being, the negation contained in it is reduced to a simple negation. So the infinite is affirmative being, the negation of the negation, but in its immediacy as that, it is the simple negation of finitude. And so it's reduced to a determinus, a limit, which then, as in contradiction with the infinite, is posited as excluded from it, as not belonging to it, as opposed to its being itself as the finite. So the infinite, in its affirmative character, is the negation of the finite and therefore limited and finite itself. But of course that means it turns into the very finite that its affirmative being excludes. So it also turns into its opposite, the opposite which it excludes. So the finite turns into the infinite which excludes it, and the infinite, in being the negation of the finite, renders itself finite, a finitude which it excludes. So what does this amount to then? What it amounts to is the infinite turning into, the finite, first of all, becoming an infinite. Let's write this up so we can think of this as a sequence of thoughts. What does it do with my... I just had... Oh, there it is. Thank you. Let's get rid of Twainson. So the first thought is that the finite turns into the infinite, which excludes it. But the infinite, in being the negation of the finite, renders itself finite, which is excluded by the infinite, and so the infinite then has to lie beyond that as that in which there is no finitude. The finite becomes the infinite, which excludes it. The infinite, however, finitizes itself, limits itself in such a way that it's no longer infinite anymore. It excludes the infinite, and the infinite excludes it, so the infinite has to be put beyond it. But then that infinite, once again, turns itself into a limit or a finite, which then repeats the series. So those thoughts, the fact that each turns into its opposite, and in so doing each excludes the opposite into which it turns, generates what Hegel called the progress to infinity. And he summarizes this a bit down the page on 141 in the paragraph that begins the process of their transition. The process of their transition has the following detailed shape. We pass from the finite to the infinite. This transcending of the finite appears as an external act because it's just a transition just happens. In this void beyond the finite, what arises? What is the positive element in it? Owing to the inseparability of the infinite and the finite, or because this infinite remaining aloof on its own side is itself limited, there arises a limit, a new limit, if you like. The infinite has vanished, and its other, the finite, has entered. So, in the void beyond the finite is the infinite, but that infinite vanishes and becomes finite again. But this entrance of the finite appears as a happening external to the infinite, and the new limit as something that does not arise from the infinite itself, but is likewise found as given. And so we are faced with a relapse into the previous determination, that this limit is itself only something that has to be sublated or transcended. And so again, there arises the void, the nothing, in which similarly the said determinateness is encountered, and so on to infinity. So we have before us, he says, the alternating determination of the finite and the infinite, which is then in the following paragraph named as the progress to infinity. So the progress to infinity is our fourth conception of infinity so far. So we have endless finitude, first of all. Then we had continuing unending being. Then we had the bad infinite. And now we have the progress to infinity. And the progress to infinity is just a further form of the bad infinite. So in fact, the bad infinite takes two forms. That of being a simple beyond, and that of being what you might call a sort of endlessly deferred beyond. And the progress to infinity, well, there's a couple of things I need to say about it. Let me before I make the comment I was going to make, just draw your attention to the subtle difference between this and endless finitude which we had before. So the endless finitude we had before was just like this. It was just a series that went on. Now, of course, we have the core of that idea still there. But now it's mediated by the fact that the finite becomes the infinite, which is itself finite in not being the infinite. So you have, again, the same sense of endlessness. The infinite as a series, which will come up in the section on quantity. The infinite is going on and on and on and on. Only here, the difference is that this infinite is generated by the simple thought that the finite gives rise to an infinite which is beyond it, which is not it. So again, it's this moment of simple negation which places the infinite beyond the finite, but which then finitizes it such that the infinite has to be beyond that, which finitizes it, and so on and so on. Now, Hegel thinks that this idea of an infinite progress is what is, if you like, this is a sort of ultimate expression of a sort of finite infinite. And it's what he thinks you get in, for example, Fichte's moral philosophy. I don't want to go into Fichte's moral philosophy, but the idea is that a moral philosophy that's constantly caught up in the sense that we ought to do this, we ought to do this. It's always reaching out beyond itself to what it ought to do, but it never quite can do it. It doesn't think that we ever do what we ought to do, but it thinks we're always caught up in oughting to do it. Hegel thinks that's a moral realization of this structure, where the ought, as it were, is always out beyond wherever we are. But then various post-Hegelians, Derrida might be one, have actually, in a sense, tried to embrace a version of this. Think of Derrida, that's why I use the term deferral. Think of Derrida's notion of a sort of an endless deferral, a differing that is a deferring. Derrida is quite aware of the fact that he's consciously bringing back a certain conception of what Hegel would call the progress to infinity. And Derrida's playing that off against what he thinks is a kind of impossible true infinite. So this concept of the progress to infinity is important. It's important within the structure of the logic, but it's also important because it recurs in various non-Hegelian philosophers who sort of see it as a way of trying to undo what is thinking. Note that it is generated by the bad infinite. This is just the logical conclusion of, if you sort of stopped there, if you took all this out, then you've just got the simple bad infinite, the infinite that lies beyond the finite. But then work through that thought, well, then that means it's got to be a finite infinite. But then where's the infinite gone? Well, the infinite has to be over there, and then so on and so on. It's just generated by that thought. It's not, in that sense, a radically new one. Hegel, well, it doesn't give a name to this directly, but in the book I've sort of named this after a remark that Hegel makes in the paragraph that begins, what we have here is an abstract transcending. So this is the penultimate paragraph under B. Okay, maybe I will just read that and then you can see where it comes to. So Hegel, he's repeating a lot. If you think there's a lot of repetition in this section, you're right. He just say the same thing over and over again. What we have here is an abstract transcending of a limit. A transcending which remains incomplete because it is not itself transcended. Before us is the infinite. It is, of course, transcended, for a new limit is posited. But the result is rather only a return to the finite. This spurious infinity is in itself the same thing as the perennial ought. Think of it. It is the negation of the finite, it is true, but it cannot in truth free itself therefrom. The finite reappears in the infinite itself as its other, because it is only in its connection with its other, the finite, that the infinite is. The progress to infinity is consequently only the perpetual repetition of the one and the same content, and the one and the same tedious alternation of this finite and infinite. So this could be named as the tedious, the boring. It just repeats itself endlessly and endlessly. In the next paragraph, though, Hegel highlights really what generates this. And the thought is that it is an infinity that is not reached because he puts it, it's not meant to be reached, because it's conceived as essentially beyond the finite. So, the next paragraph, I'm not going to read all of it, I'm going to skip down about 10 lines. And he says, this infinite has the fixed determination of a beyond, which cannot be reached for the very reason that it's not meant to be reached, because the determinateness of the beyond, of the affirmative negation, is not let go. Now that idea of not letting something go should remind you, or may remind you, of what Hegel talked about when he first introduced finitude. So when he first introduced finitude, this was back under finitude alpha, the immediacy of finitude. And he said in the second paragraph, I think it was, that you have these two alternatives. One holding fast to the being of the finite. This is back on page 130. One is holding fast to the being of the finitude and the transitoriness continuing to be, or whether the transitoriness and the ceasing to be cease to be. And I pointed out that Miller adds in a little lets in the first option, which really doesn't belong there. There's no letting going on in the first option. That's holding fast to the being of the finitude. Whereas the second alternative, is letting the finite be finite, letting the ceasing to be cease to be. Well, here you've got a repetition of that holding on. Only now it's not holding on to the finite, it's holding on to the idea of the infinite as the other of the finite, as not the finite. So that conception of the infinite is not let go. And that, I think, is what he means by saying the infinite here is a beyond that cannot be reached because it's not meant to be reached, because it's understood as the negation of the finite, as a beyond. But as we've seen, the idea of the infinite as a beyond is that of a finite infinite. It's not what infinity is. Now, we don't know what true infinity is yet, but we know that that can't be it, because that's a finite infinite. And if the infinite is unending being, then it's not finite. So if it's not finite, how can it be finite? So something needs to be worked out here. Right, so that concludes the discussion of the progress to infinity. It's brief, but as I say, it's an important conception of infinity. And you see it wherever you get a series generated by a kind of infinite deferral, a constantly postponed beyond, that is always beyond wherever you are. And we're familiar with this in many ways. I mean, it's a logical structure, but you can see it in various forms of utopian thinking, I suppose. What Hegel might consider to be a bad infinite, that wherever you are, the world can always be better. That's the moral view. We're in a terrible situation, it'll always be better. But when we're there, it'll always be better. It'll always be better. Right, so what Hegel now does is move on to consider the true infinite. But clearly the true infinite can't be anything beyond the progress to infinity. In that sense, the true infinite can't ultimately be beyond the bad infinite. Otherwise it would just repeat the bad infinite. It will be another beyond. So what Hegel claims is that we just have to attend to what is going on in the structure of the progress to infinity. And this is what he says in the beginning of C, affirmative infinity. In this alternating determination of the finite and the infinite from one to the other and back again, their truth is already implicitly present, and all that is required is to take up what is before us. That's very important. To discover the true infinite, you don't need to look anywhere else than the progress to infinity. There is nowhere else to look. Because this is what finitude and infinity have proven to be. There's nowhere else to look. Now, I suggested last time that you could save yourself a little bit of bother by skipping from 143 to 146. And I'm going to do the same here, just to save time. But also because what follows immediately from what Hegel's just said here is said, when we get to 146, to have been an external comparison of the finite and the infinite. It's very interesting, but given that we're not supposed to be engaging in external comparisons, I think we can spare ourselves looking at that. So if you move forward to 146, which is 116 in the Di Giovanni, the paragraph I'm looking at is the one that begins in the first place, both the infinite and the finite are negated. Secondly, they are posited one after another. And he then goes on and says, we thus compare these two determinations, just as in our comparison, an external comparing, we have separated the two modes. So that suggests that what we've been doing is an external comparing. So I'm going to pick up the sentence that follows this. So in the Miller it says, But the infinite progress expresses more than this, and that connects nicely to the sentence we saw on page 143. The infinite progress expresses more than just this infinite progress. So what is that more? What more is going on that we haven't yet seen? Well, that more, Hegel claims, is that, putting it very simply, in this process whereby the finite becomes its opposite, the infinite, which immediately becomes its opposite, which points beyond it, we in fact have a process whereby each term relates to itself. So this is a further version of the second form of infinity we saw earlier. But the finite, in pointing beyond itself, becoming the infinite that is beyond it, actually just relates to itself again. And so proves to be the process of relating to itself in its other. The infinite too. Here the infinite is beyond the finite, but that makes it finite, so it points beyond itself to an infinite, which is beyond it, but in that infinite it just relates to itself as well. So it too proves to be the process of relating to itself in its other. Each in that process turns to be, comes to be what Hegel calls a movement of returning to itself via its negation. But as the movement of returning to itself via the negation, it's not just one side of that relation. It is the movement of relating to itself on the other side, as it were. All right, so where does Hegel say this? Okay. The paragraph that begins at the bottom of 146 in the Miller, in the first place, the negation of the finite and the infinite. It's the one immediately after the reference to external comparing. If we look halfway through that paragraph, the top of 147. So Hegel first thinks about the finite. It's about 5 lines down. He says, first there is the finite. Then this is transcended, and this negative or beyond of the finite is the infinite. And then this negation is again transcended, so that there arises a new limit, the finite again. This is the complete self-closing movement, which is arrived at that which constituted the beginning. What arises is the same as that from which the movement began. That is, the finite is restored. It is therefore united with itself, has in its beyond only found itself again. Then he argues the same happens to the infinite. The same is the case with the infinite. In the infinite, the beyond of the limit, there arises only another limit which has the same fate, namely that as finite it must be negated and transcended. Thus what is present again, beyond the finite that the infinite has just turned out to be, is the same infinite which had previously disappeared in the new limit. The infinite, therefore, through its sublating, is not removed any further either from the finite or from itself, for it has arrived at its own self. So then continuing, he then, as it were, reviews what each has proven to be. Thus both finite and infinite are this movement in which each returns to itself through its negation. They are only as mediation with themselves. And the affirmative of each contains the negative of each and is the negation of the negation, since each relates to itself in the other. So each relates to itself through, as it were, not just becoming its own negative. Note the structural change that's happened. I mean, you're just looking at the same idea. It's just what it means to be the finite now has changed its meaning. Instead of just being the finite as opposed to the infinite, It's now become the process of relating to itself beyond itself in the finite, the infinite to which it's opposed. And similarly, the infinite, instead of being that which is just opposed to the finite, and so which must lie beyond the very finite that it proves to be, is now the movement of relating to itself beyond itself. So each becomes this movement of returning to itself through its negation. Each, therefore, is the mediation with itself. It mediates with itself with itself through the other. But he also goes on to note that they can only, as it were, result in being this movement. They're not this movement at the start. So he says they are thus a result, and consequently not what they are in the determination of their beginning. The finite is not a determinate being on its side, and the infinite a determinate being beyond the determinate being. Okay, seeing this, Hegel says, requires nothing other than letting go of the simple fixed idea that the finite is here and the infinite is there. And you let go of that idea but by seeing more in it than you do if you just fixate on it. And that's pretty much what Hegel's all about. Basically, if that was it, is there a method to Hegel? It's that. It's seeing more in a particular structure than you see if you just fixate on that structure. There is a kind of blindness that comes with obsessively fixating on whatever is there in front of you. And that's what understanding will do. Understanding will insist that the finite is finite and the infinite is infinite. And it might go as far as saying, okay, well that infinite is a finite infinite, but then the infinite's over there, and over there, and over there, and over there. But it still fixates on the idea of a beyond. But if you allow what's present, as it were, to show itself, I'm saying that in a somewhat Heideggerian way, to sort of bring out that there are some parallels here with Heidegger, then you get to see that the finite is in fact a process, a movement, which results in it relating to itself beyond itself, and the infinite is the same. Hegel goes on to say that that movement, each is the same movement. And so in fact it doesn't really matter which you begin with. They both prove to be the same movement. And it's that movement which is true infinity. So true infinity is the movement, the process of uniting with oneself beyond oneself in the other. And it's a quality of being, it's a way of being that is exhibited by the moments of the progress to infinity. Let's just continue, just so that this is all clear. Right, I'm skipping the rest of that paragraph that first introduced the thought of movement, and going on to the next paragraph. If at first the return into self was considered to be just as much a return of the finite to itself as a return of the infinite to itself, this very result reveals an error which is connected with the one-sidedness just criticized. First the finite and then the infinite is taken as the starting point, and it is only this that gives rise to two results. It is, however, a matter of complete indifference which is taken as the beginning, and thus the difference which occasioned the double result disappears in itself. This is likewise explicit in the line of the infinite progress, in which each of the moments presents itself in equal alternation, and it is quite immaterial what point is fixed on, or which of the two is taken at the beginning. Since both are the finite, since both the finite and the infinite itself are moments of the progress, they are jointly or in common the finite. And since they are equally together negated in it and in the result, this result as the negation of the finitude of both is called with truth the infinite. So, once we have the idea that each is the same movement of uniting with itself beyond itself, that movement is now the true infinite. And so the two, understood as distinct from one another, now both become the finite as moments of that process. So we've shifted to a new logical structure, one of process and moments as opposed to this and that. And of course we had this with Becoming. The last time we had this idea really was in Becoming, where in Becoming, being and nothing were moments of the very process that they constituted. Remember, there was that ambiguity that being and nothing, being is its vanishing into nothing, nothing is its vanishing into being. So nothing and being are the process of vanishing, and they're also moments of that process, because being is the vanishing of being into nothing. So you get becoming a moment and becoming a process are the same. You get the same thing happening here. That the finite and the infinite become this process of which they are then moments. And as moments, they count as the finite. So again, since both the finite and the infinite are moments of the progress, they are jointly in common the finite. So, Hegel points out that finitude and infinite now have a double meaning. The finite has the double meaning of being first, only the finite over against the infinite, which stands opposed to it, and secondly, of being the finite and at the same time the infinite opposed to it, namely as a moment. So to be finite here means, first of all, to stand over against the infinite. The infinite is beyond it. But to be finite also means to be with the infinite, a moment of the process of true infinity. And the infinite also has a double meaning. It has the double meaning of being one of these two moments. As such, it is the spurious infinite, the bad infinite beyond the finite. And also the infinite in which both the finite and its other are only moments. The infinite as the process that both prove to be. So that is what Hegel understands to be true infinity. Why is it called infinity? Because it's being that doesn't end. It's being that unites with itself in its negation. So insofar as we think of these as negatives of one another, the finite stops, ends where the infinite is, and the infinite, as it were, stops where the finite is. That's why each of them is finite. But here we have a being that doesn't end, that relates to itself in its negation. And note that it doesn't need, you don't in fact need the endless series to find this. You've got it already there, or here. There is already qualitative infinity. So truly infinite being, for Hegel, doesn't go on and on and on and on and on. It is that movement of uniting with oneself in the other. Okay. If you don't mind, and then we will take a break. I want to continue with just highlighting a few points here. Okay. First of all, in the next paragraph, Hegel, it's not a terribly important point perhaps, but he points out that you can't capture the notion of the true infinite by calling it the unity of the finite and the infinite, which is how some people do describe it. And Hegel will describe it like that himself. But what he's highlighting here is that doesn't bring out the processual character of true infinity. So don't just sort of revert to thinking, well, the true infinite is the unity of the two. It's more than that. Secondly, in the next paragraph, the true infinite is nothing transcendent. That is absolutely essential. It's bad infinity for Hegel that is a transcendent infinity. And so in this respect, Hegel is much closer to Spinoza than to anybody else. Although Hegel is not Spinoza, he's very close to Spinoza. And just think then of other philosophers for whom transcendence is central. Kant being obviously one, Levinas being probably the clearest example. Hegel is not denying, as I said before, that there is bad infinity in being. So in an odd way, he allows space for an element of transcendence, but only within the world. And to some extent, we are it. We are that moment of transcending the world within the world, in that we can distance ourselves from it. But there is, for Hegel, no fundamental transcendence. And again, to highlight the paradox, it's for that reason that he thinks Christianity is the true religion. Precisely for that reason.
Have you got a quote from the page where it says we transcend the present moment?
No, that was just if you the idea of Hegel does provide examples of the progress to infinity, but as far as I'm aware, I don't know that I could put my finger on a page in which he says, here is bad infinity in the world. But what I try to do in the opening of Hegel's logic is find two examples myself. One is from light in the philosophy of nature, and the other is consciousness. So the way Hegel describes consciousness, for example, in the philosophy of subjective spirit, makes it very clear that consciousness is both sort of overreaches itself in a way that's kind of like true infinity, but it also sets itself over against. And so that seems to have something of the character of, at least in part, bad infinite. But there's, to my knowledge, I don't know that we can find a quotation where Hegel says, this is the embodiment of the bad infinite. What he does say, though, is that this true infinity is present. Okay, so the next paragraph, this infinity as a consummated return into itself, blah, 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 blah. It is and is there, present before us. And he uses the word present. Actually, he uses the word present and then emphasizes it with gegenwärtig, which is just the German for present. So this really matters a lot to him. That, es ist da, präsent, gegenwärtig. The infinite is present, here and now. It's absolutely central to Hegel. The absolute, where's the absolute? It's here. It's nowhere, there's nowhere else to go. There is no moment of transcendence in that sense, ultimately, in Hegel's account of infinity. And that upsets the Levinasians, but Hegel's just going to say, well, this is true infinity, what I'm describing here. This is true infinity. What other thinkers are thinking about when they're talking about transcendence isn't true infinity, whatever else it is. True infinity involves immanence, radical immanence. And I'm sloganizing that to make a point, but I think I've tried to show how this manifests itself. And note also that true infinity manifests itself within the sphere of the finite. It is the process whereby the finite turns into this relating to self in its other. And so Hegel will later think of, if you think of the philosophy of right, all the structures in the philosophy of right that are talked of as being moments of infinity. Love is true infinity, because you relate to yourself in the other. When you fall apart, get divorced, then obviously the true infinity is gone, because you really don't find yourself in the other. But while that love, that friendship is continuing, then you are exhibiting the quality of infinite being in that relation. Mutual recognition is infinite being. It's in the relationship between the two. So I think this is really important. Now the last point I want to make before we have a little break is Hegel goes on to make a remark about idealism. The volume of 149. And I think this is the point really to get clear what Hegel means by idealism. He says that this is the final paragraph before we get to transition. Page 149. And he introduces the notion of ideality because he's just introduced the notion of reality, and he's sort of trying to qualify what he's saying. The more precise reason for recalling the category of reality here is that the negation to which it is opposed, as the affirmative, is here the negation of the negation. As such, it is itself opposed to the reality which finite term being is. The negation is thus termed as ideality. Okay, here you got it. Ideal being, das Ideelle. This is not what you'll get in the aesthetics, das Ideal. This is das Ideelle. Ideal being is the finite as it is in the true infinite, as a determination, a content, which is distinct but is not an independent, self-subsistent being, but only a moment. So to be ideal is to be a moment of a process, putting it bluntly. That is a logical structure that can be exhibited by ideas, but it can also be exhibited by people, but it also can be exhibited, it is exhibited in our bodies at this very minute. My hand is an ideal moment of my body. But this pen, the top, is not an ideal moment of the pen, because I can just take it a bit. These are separate, if you like, related as mechanical objects. They're just separate. But obviously, unless you're double jointed, you can't do this with your hand or your elbow or your arm. They are the ideal moments of the process that your body is. So, what does idealism mean? It simply means, for Hegel at this point at least, that the world is not made up of some things and others, of finites that are simply determinate with respect to something else, but it constitutes a process within which those finites are moments. And it does so more or less explicitly. So organisms, for example, are more explicitly, have more explicitly the structure of true infinity than, for example, a bag of billiards balls will have. And self-conscious beings, particularly when they're in relation to others, whether they are in a family or in a state or just in a relation to mutual recognition, where they are moments of the relation they constitute, exhibit the structure of being ideal more explicitly than two people just walking past the street. I mean, they are also, in a sense, ideal, in the sense that they belong to one society, even though they don't know it. And of course, what we often forget is when we focus on our individuality, is the extent to which that being an individual is itself a moment of a social order. So, you can't contrast Hegel's idealism with materialism. It just makes no sense. Because material structures like bodies, parts of bodies, are ideal. Also, this has nothing to do with cognitive idealism. It's got nothing to do with Berkeley, with Kant, with things not really existing, with things being mind independent. There's absolutely nothing to do with that at all. It's a structural point. This is real, or réel, because it's just there. It just stands there, and it's different from that. But parts of a body, or lovers in a relationship, are ideal moments of the relation they constitute. I suppose parts of the earth, you could say the earth, parts of the earth, the seas, the mountains, are ideal moments. To the extent that that earth is a single coherent organism. So, that is clearly the official line on idealism. I'm not sure many people realise that. And of course you may still have objections to the idea, but you can't contrast Hegel's idealism with a more materialist version. It just makes no sense at all. And this is why I think Marx completely, in this sense, misses that point, even though in other respects, Marx accepts very much a similar kind of view of the world to Hegel. It's just you can't translate it into material terms because the distinction doesn't work in that way. All right, I would say let's have a little break now. Sorry for going over, and then we'll talk about all of this, and then if there's time, we'll move on into being itself.